Copenhagen, December 1943. A Gestapo officer steps out of his staff car on a Mali guide. 3 resistance fighters watch from a cafe window 20 meters away. One pulls a length of metal tubing from inside his coat. No safety catch clicks, no slide racks, just a slow, deliberate aim. The sound that follows is quieter than the officer's boot hitting the pavement. He drops without a word. His driver doesn't even turn around. By the time anyone realizes what's happened, the cafe is empty, and 3 Danes are walking calmly towards Nyhavn harbour. The weapon disappears back into a coat sleeve. It looks like a piece of plumbing. The Germans will spend 6 hours searching for a sniper rifle. They'll never find it, because it was fired DA standard 9mm pistol produces approximately 160 decibels at the muzzle. That's loud enough to cause immediate permanent hearing damage. It's loud enough to be clearly heard half a mile away in open country. In an urban environment, it's loud enough to wake sleeping people 3 streets over. The Welrod produced 73 decibels. 73 decibels is the sound of a car door closing. It's the sound of normal conversation. It's the sound of someone setting down a teacup with slightly too much force. At 10 meters distance, the sound of a Welrod firing drops to roughly 60 decibels. That's quieter than a household vacuum cleaner. It's quieter than rainfall on a window. In practical terms, this meant you could fire a Welrod in one room of a house without anyone in the next room being certain they'd heard anything at all. You could fire it on a city street without pedestrians 30 meters away turning their heads. You could fire it in the same room as a wireless playing at moderate volume, and the sound would be lost entirely. There's a documented account from SOE training records of an instructor firing a Welrod in a classroom while a lecture was ongoing in the adjacent room. After the demonstration, he walked next door and asked if anyone had heard anything unusual. Not a single hand went up. The weapon itself was almost comically simple. The grip was a plain steel tube wrapped in rubber for purchase. It concealed a detachable magazine holding 6 rounds, later increased to 8 in some models. The barrel extended from the front, encased entirely within the suppressor assembly. There was no trigger guard, just a curved trigger emerging from the bottom. The whole thing weighed just over a kilogram, light enough to be carried all day without fatigue. Production began in late 1942 at a small facility in Birmingham. The exact numbers remain classified even now, 80 years later. Estimates range from 2,800 units to perhaps 14,000. The variation reflects the extraordinary secrecy surrounding the program. Serial numbers were deliberately scattered across non-sequential ranges to prevent anyone from calculating production totals. Documentation was minimal, and most of it was destroyed after the war. Even now, the Ministry of Defense maintains classification on specific Welrod operational records. The first Welrods reached occupied Europe in early 1943. What happened next changed the nature of resistance warfare. If you're finding this account useful, subscribing to Britain Lives On helps us continue bringing these stories to light. We're committed to telling Britain's war from sources that matter. The Welrod reached SOE networks across occupied Europe through the standard supply drops. Agents would mark drop zones with torches, and RAF Whitleys or Halifaxes would release containers by parachute. Inside those containers, wrapped in oilcloth, alongside plastic explosives and ammunition and forged papers, were Welrods. The French resistance, particularly the Maquis networks in the south, used them for what they termed executive actions. Collaborators who had betrayed safe houses were found dead in their beds. Milice officers who tortured resistance members were shot in the street, and their killers were gone before anyone understood what had occurred. German officers who distinguished themselves through particular brutality towards French civilians tended to die quietly. There's an account in the Imperial War Museum archives, reference SOE F-43, describing an operation in Lyon in August 1943. The target was a Gestapo interpreter who'd been present during interrogations at Montluc prison. He was considered directly responsible for at least 17 resistance arrests. The problem was his routine. He lived in a requisitioned apartment in a building full of German administrative staff, guards on every entrance, Wehrmacht personnel on every floor. The SOE agent, a Frenchman whose field name was Anatole, solved the problem by waiting until the target visited a particular café on Rue de la République. Anatole sat 3 tables away. When the target rose to use the lavatory, Anatole followed. The Welrod was fired once, contact distance, behind the ear. Anatole walked out through the café's rear entrance, down an alley, onto a crowded boulevard. The body wasn't discovered for 20 minutes. Nobody in the café had heard anything. In Denmark, the Holger Danske resistance group received Welrods through drops coordinated with SOE's Danish section. They used them extensively against informants. The Danish resistance faced a particular problem. Denmark's population density meant that most operations occurred in urban areas. A loud weapon meant rapid German response. The Welrod allowed eliminations in conditions that would have been suicidal otherwise. There's a recorded account from a Holger Danske member, Harold Peterson, interviewed after the war. He described an operation in Aarhus in early 1944. The target was a Danish Nazi who'd provided the Germans with a list of local resistance members, leading to 14 arrests and 6 executions. The man lived above a shop on a narrow street with German billets on both sides. Peterson and 2 others entered the building at midday, climbed the stairs, knocked on the door. When it opened, Peterson shot the man once in the chest with a Welrod. They walked back down the stairs, past other residents, out onto the street. The first the Germans knew about it was when the man's wife found the body an hour later. Nobody had reported hearing a shot. Norway's SOE networks, operating under the codename Operation Grouse and later Gunnerside, used Welrods during sabotage operations. The famous Vemork heavy water raid didn't require assassinations, but other operations did. Guards at German installations could be eliminated without alerting nearby patrols. The silence bought precious seconds, and seconds meant survival. The psychological impact on German occupation forces was considerable. Officers began to understand that being indoors provided no protection. The absence of gunfire didn't mean the absence of danger. Informants became harder to recruit when collaboration carried the risk of silent death. Some Abwehr officers requested transfers out of resistance-heavy areas. Gestapo personnel in France began varying their routines, avoiding regular appointments, travelling with guards. It didn't always help. But the Welrod had one critical limitation that nobody talks about. The Welrod's integrated suppressor had a finite lifespan. The rubber wipes that sealed around each bullet as it passed through the baffle stack degraded with use. After approximately 12 rounds, the wipes were damaged enough that sound suppression began to decrease noticeably. After 30 rounds, the Welrod was no quieter than a conventional suppressed pistol. The weapon still functioned, but it had lost its primary advantage. SOE operational doctrine recommended replacing the wipes after every 6 rounds. This required partial disassembly of the weapon and installation of fresh rubber seals. The process wasn't complicated, but it did require tools and replacement parts. For an agent operating in occupied territory, obtaining replacement wipes meant waiting for a supply drop or a courier run. Some agents simply used their Welrods once or twice, then buried them and waited for a replacement. This stands in stark contrast to what the Germans and Americans were developing. German suppressed weapons during this period were primarily adapted service pistols. The Walther PPK could be fitted with a screw-on suppressor that reduced sound to approximately 115 decibels. Quieter than unsuppressed, certainly, but still unmistakably a gunshot. The Germans designed their suppressors for a different purpose, reducing shooter signature for snipers, not enabling assassination in crowds. The Americans produced the high-standard HDM, a suppressed .22 caliber pistol used by the OSS. It was remarkably quiet, achieving approximately 90 decibels. But the .22 round severely limited effectiveness. Multiple shots were often required to guarantee a kill. Penetration through heavy winter clothing was unreliable. Against a target wearing a leather coat or thick wool, a .22 might not achieve lethal penetration at all. The Welrod's 9mm round, even with reduced powder, delivered substantially more stopping power. One shot, properly placed, was fatal. By the numbers, the comparison is stark. The Welrod achieved 73 decibels with a 9mm round. The American HDM achieved 90 decibels with a .22. German suppressed pistols rarely managed better than 115 decibels. In the mathematics of silent killing, the Welrod existed in a category entirely alone. The Welrod remained in British service long after the war ended. It was used during the Malayan emergency. It was used in Kenya during the Mau Mau uprising. It was reportedly used in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, though official records remain sealed. The last confirmed operational use was during the Falklands War in 1982, when SAS personnel carried Welrods during reconnaissance operations. A weapon designed in 1942 for killing informants in occupied Europe was still being issued to British Special Forces 40 years later. That tells you everything you need to know about how well it worked. The Welrod was never meant to win battles. It was meant to win something far more important, the silence that lets a resistance fighter kill a collaborator and walk away. In that mission, it succeeded beyond anything its designers could have imagined, and in 80 years of suppressor development since, nothing has ever been quieter. Some technologies represent incremental improvement. The Welrod represented something else entirely. It represented the moment when Britain's engineers stopped trying to make guns quieter and instead built silence itself into a weapon.